Matthew chapter 6, verse 10a. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Gospel of Luke chapter 11, verse 2b. Hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Message today from Pastor Smith is the door to God.
There are some radical things in this prayer, and we don't often appreciate it because we pray it every Sunday, and I think when you pray something all the time, you just sort of skip through it. So I want to be sure that we recognize some of the radical things that we pray when we pray that prayer. I think it's well for us to remember that in Jesus' day, the idea of divinity and human were impossibly disconnected from each other. The fellow that reached out to steady the ark as it was being moved, who died, was a reflection of the idea that if you get too close to God, you die. You can't see God without dying. And we also have when Israel was moving through the wilderness and Moses had to go up into the mountain because God called him to go up. He warned everybody, stay away from the mountain. Don't get up on the mountain because you will die if you come too close. And so for humans to address God was a dangerous thing. And the religions of that day depended on trying to find ways of human beings bringing their petitions to the God or gods that they believed in, because they could not directly interface with those gods. That's what the temples were all about. And some of the rituals, when you brought your request to a particular temple, it went to someone who had access to God and could talk with God because you couldn't. So imagine when one of the disciples, according to Luke, said to Jesus, teach us how to pray. And the prayer starts off, our Father. Now that word our is terribly important because every time we address God with that prayer, we are connected with everybody else. We can't pray to God for ourselves because we recognize that the one we are praying to is the Father for all of us and connects all of us. And so the gospel was radical even at that time because it forced us to pray not just to God, but about all of the children. And the prayer goes on, our Father. Now, I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago in a sermon, that the word Father is hardly found in the Old Testament. It's found in a few places, but God isn't addressed as Father very often in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, God is addressed as Father. In fact, Paul, in his letters, spoke of God as Daddy, Abba, the familiar form. And in Jesus and in Paul, we come to a completely different idea of the relationship we have with God. Remember that when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he mentioned two. He didn't just say, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, which would have been true if our relationship with God was just for ourselves. But then Jesus said, but there's a second one too, that you love your neighbor as yourself. That somehow to love God includes loving everybody else too. And that's the hard part for us. You know, it would be easy to love God, if it didn't carry this responsibility to also shed our love out much wider, even as Jesus talks about, even to our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us. So the prayer as it begins is a powerful shock to people who had a different understanding of what our relationship with God would be all about. And then, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. They're different. And I looked up the word holy in internet, and I saw they're pertaining to the divine, those who have a deeper relationship with God and the things of God. But when I was in seminary, one of our Hebrew professors explained to us that the word holy, in Hebrew at least, means other than, different, unique. That when we talk about God, we're talking about someone who rests outside our complete understanding, someone who looks at whatever reality there is from a different perspective than ours. And that when we are invited into holiness, it means that we're invited into the same perspective, the same understanding that God has. And when Jesus talks about, being perfect, like your Father in heaven is perfect, this is what he's talking about, is the idea that we are always perfecting, we are always coming closer to a new understanding, a different way of life than we're used to. And then, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Can you imagine what that would do to all the societal rules, all the mores, all the cultures? How different life would be if it was the way it was in heaven? I mean, that's what God is wanting from us, because he created the creation for a certain purpose. And frankly, we keep getting in the way. And so when we pray this prayer, we're asking for something that's radical. Now, I said it was dangerous, and I meant that in the sense that we resist radical change. We resist having someone tell us that what we think of as right and wrong is not right and wrong for them. When Jesus tells us to forgive, we're willing to forgive up to a certain point, but we don't want to forgive past that point. And Jesus would. We saw it in his life, and the stories that he told, and the way he was with people, and he made people angry. You remember that first time he went to the synagogue and was given the opportunity to read from Isaiah. And when he got done reading with Isaiah, everybody was so proud of him because he had read it so well, and he interpreted it, until he said, "Today, this is made a reality. I'm the one who's coming." And he began to talk about how in the past, in Israel's history, the prophets ministered to people who weren't Jews. And they cared about people who were outside the covenant. And it made everybody angry because they were used to hearing only people within the covenant could have these blessings. And you remember they tried to throw him over the cliff, but he was able to walk and be safe and get away. But Jesus had a way of making people angry because what he saw as a way to live was radically different than the people who had an understanding of that in their day. And I think the same thing is true today. Jesus is more radical than we think. I remember in Bernie, my second parish, I asked the congregation to read one of the Gospels before the next Sunday, and that we would have a discussion about it. And of course, nobody did. And they were upset with me because they didn't preach a sermon. I had expected them to read the gospel so we could talk about it. So I gave them the assignment for a second week. And I think there were two people who were prepared to have a conversation about Jesus and the gospel. We had a communicants class meet after the service. And one of the older couples that was in the communicants class, when we came into the room, said, Don, we're really glad that you pushed us to read one of the gospels over and over again until Jesus became real to us, because we hadn't realized before how much he was like a hippie. And that really struck me because, you know, hippies were seen to be dangerous people, but this couple had come to see that some of the values of Jesus they had recognized in this radical group that they read about. I remember one time I was growing a beard, and I haven't always had a beard, but this is my second one. And it wasn't really something I was doing. I had been on vacation for 2 weeks, and I came back with stubble, and I decided to let it grow. And I remember getting threats from the congregation. And so that Sunday before I shaved, and I did it because one of the families lost a loved one and they hadn't seen me, and I didn't want to show up at the funeral with a distraction. But in the sermon, I mentioned that I hoped that the next time they saw someone walking down the street with a beard, instead of saying to themselves, well, this is a hippie, instead, think of that person as someone who looked like their pastor. And it makes all the difference in the world. And one of the young mothers at the end, when people were coming out and I was greeting everybody, she said, thank you for that. Because it does make a difference in the way I look at men with beards. So all I'm saying, these are just small examples of the times when the gospel forces us to look at the world differently than we did before. And we need to expect that when we pray to God, that's what's going to happen. That in the Lord's Prayer, we are reminded and told that what we want is for all of us to be blessed by God by seeing the world the way God does, responding in the world the way God does, catching up with God on the changes that need to be made in our world because we see it differently than we did before. The Lord's Prayer, as I said last week, is not meant to be the only prayer we pray. We are expected to pray our own prayers, put our own words, our own practicalities, the world we live in our prayers. And each one of us as a disciple is called and encouraged and warned that it's terribly important that we pray to God on not just my behalf, but on all of yours and the rest of the world's behalf. That we never forget that the world is a bigger place, the kingdom is a bigger place than our own interest. Maybe from time to time, we need to pray something other than the Lord's Prayer. Maybe another prayer that is one that we memorize and learn, and so that we begin to taste the rest of prayer life. And as we go through the Lord's Prayer and the phrases that are found there, see new understandings so that when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we're thinking different images than we do now.